So, yes, now I hope my screen is visible. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Power BI meetup, hosted by Azerbaijan Data and AI Community. Today's session is titled Beyond the Spreadsheet, Securing Excel and Power BI in a Modern Data World. And in this session, we'll look beyond creating reports and dashboards. I hope this is the good definitions of the purpose of today's session. And once again, thank you for joining us today. And I'm very happy to have you here. Um, so this session is designed. This session is designed for a wide audience, including everyday Excel and Power BI users, report creators, analysts, consultants, and security professionals. I hope by the end of this session, everyone who joins today's session will leave with practical ideas that can be applied in their own work environment. So now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Anna Bardyuk. Anna is a data security consultant and Microsoft MVP. She works with organizations across the public and private sectors around the world, helping them define, implement, and operationalize data security programs using Microsoft Data Security Solutions. I hope Anna will give the necessary information about herself in upcoming minutes. But what I would like to tell about her is that Anna also actively shares her knowledge with the broader security community, and we are very happy to welcome her to our meetup. Anna, thank you for joining us today. So, a little bit about upcoming speakers. Uh, we are continuing to bring experienced professionals from the Microsoft data, AI, and analytics communities to share their knowledge with our members. And in our upcoming sessions, we'll welcome speakers such as Rolf McLaughlin and Olena Borzenka. And we will continue covering practical topics around Power BI, Microsoft Fabric, AI, and data security and community learning. So please follow the Azerbaijan Data and AI Meetup group so that you do not miss upcoming events. And let's go with the next slide. So a little bit about Meetup rules. First, please feel free to ask questions. You can write your questions in the chat during the session, and we'll try to cover them in the Q&A part. Second, we may record and share this session with the community. Actually, this is lively streaming on YouTube, and it means that it will be available for those who cannot attend this time lively their session. Third, please follow up after the event. You can connect with the speaker, actually with myself also. You can join our meetup group and continue the discussion with the community. So this is the just our session schedule for the first 5 minutes that I'm doing right now is all about introduction. Then I will deliver stage to our speaker who will go on with her main presentation for next 40 or 45 minutes. And at the end, we'll have Q&A session. Okay, a little bit about data days. So under the Data Days 2026 project, Microsoft organized data days. It means that there are different study groups that is about DP 700 and DP 600 and PL 300 exams, Power BI, Fabric Engineer, and Fabric certification courses. So you can join to them. And by the way, I'm also hosting my PL 300 study group. So you can join to this study group that will help you to be successful if you have not taken your PL 300 exam in this exam. So with that, I'm happy to hand over to Anna. Anna, stage is yours. And here I'm going to stop sharing and go on, and good luck.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the wonderful intro, Ilgar. Can everybody see my screen? I'm just going to put it into present mode.
Yes, your screen is visible.
Perfect. Okay. So again, thank you so much for having me, Ilgar. Very excited to be here today. I love joining user groups like this because this is where I find people come with very interesting questions, detailed technical questions. So looking forward to having some discussion after the session today. So the session today, Securing Excel and Power BI with Microsoft Purview, it is really coming from, as Ilgar introduced, I'm a data security administrator and consultant. So it's coming from a data security perspective, but tailored to Excel and Power BI end users. So Microsoft Purview, we use it to secure our data. And as you all know, Excel and Power BI often has very sensitive data stored within. Now, especially with, Gen AI rollouts such as M365 Copilot, these tools have access to the data that you have access to. So there are many organizations that are going and implementing Microsoft Purview data security controls in order to secure that very sensitive data from AI usage, but also just general external sharing use cases, for example. So end users of Excel and Power BI, as the end users here, you are likely seeing the impacts of these Microsoft Purview data security control rollouts. And I think it's very important to know that this is here for your benefit, for the organization's benefit, for securing the data, preventing data breaches. And it's also very important to know how to work with these data security controls that are being rolled out. So in today's session, we will cover exactly that. Before we do, quick introduction. I'm Anna. I'm a data security consultant at Protiviti, also a Microsoft Purview MVP. Was honored to be awarded the MISA Security Changemaker of the Year in 2026. And I myself am also a co-founder of a user group, the International Data Security User Group, where we cover these types of data security topics on a monthly basis. So if you're interested in connecting, maybe have questions after the session, there is a QR code on the screen that has a link to my LinkedIn. Feel free to message me with any questions. So on today's agenda, we're going to start off by talking about why is it so important to protect your data, especially as I mentioned, as organizations are rolling out M365 Copilot or other enterprise generative AI tools that have access to your data. Then we'll talk about how to protect your data. So there's going to be certain sections, just in case we have administrators on the call, tailored to IT administrators, but most of the content will be designed for Excel and Power BI end users. And then we're going to talk about the impacts of protecting your data. So what should you expect? What will you see? And how do you work with these impacts? So before we get into that, 4.4 million USD. This is the global average cost of a data breach. And this is data from 2025. So honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if that number was any higher this year. Data breaches are expensive. So it's very important that as organizations and as users within organizations, we work together to make sure that data breaches are avoided. So hopefully you can understand protecting your data is very important. And here on the screen, I have a typical kind of workflow that I have heard that I have seen Excel and Power BI users go through. So let's say you have a typical Excel file. Maybe it has some sensitive information, customer names, revenue numbers, a couple of account numbers, perhaps. And then based on that Excel file, you use it as the source for building a Power BI report on top of that data. You want to maybe aggregate that data, summarize it in a visual fashion, and you want to share it with the wider team. So you go ahead and share it maybe from the Power BI service, or maybe you export that report and share the actual PBIX file with the broader team itself. So we go through this workflow. Again, I know there's intricacies, there's maybe different workflows that go on, but this is a very typical one that I see. From a data security perspective, my question is immediately, where does that sensitive data go next? And who can open that shared file? These are key questions that as end users, you need to ask yourself. Because you're working with this sensitive data, and let's say you're authorized to see these customer names, revenue numbers, but maybe you then share it with somebody that shouldn't actually see that data. That is a significant data security risk. Or maybe you share it externally. That is a very common example of an exfiltration of sensitive data. So protecting your data is important. We want to make sure that sensitive data within a typical workflow like this, we have answers to the question, where does it go next and who can open it? Data breaches have significant negative impacts. As you've seen, financial impact is huge. 4.4 million USD is a large number for the average cost of a data breach. There's also legal exposure to take into account. So, for example, if you're working with credit card data, maybe you need to consider PCI DSS. There's also, depending on where you are around the world, many different laws and regulations, and maybe even contractual obligations that you need to consider for protecting your data. Data breaches also cause damage to reputation. Let's say you're working with customers, you have their credit card numbers, and you're involved in a credit card number leak. That is a significant damage to the organization's reputation. That can also lead to loss of business, right? If your customers do not trust that their data is secure, that can lead to a loss of business. And sensitive data leakage, that's really the key thing that we are trying to protect with these Microsoft Purview controls. So the key point I want to make is everyone plays an important role in data protection, and it is a shared responsibility. So every creator who works or builds with an Excel file or a Power BI report that has sensitive data has the power to decide how that data is handled. But on the other side, every administrator is responsible for setting guardrails that enable both secure and productive work. So there's always that balance between security and productivity. We want to make sure that our data remains secure, but we also do not want to block our users from going on and having a productive workday. So finding that balance is very important. Again, data protection is every user's job, regardless of whether you're a creator or an administrator. Yes, these two different personas come in at different points of the data security journey. Administrators will define the controls, set the guardrails, deploy policies, deploy labels. Creators will work with the impact of deploying those controls, like applying labels to their files, working with some blocks from policies, perhaps. However, it is important that these two groups work together and really have that common goal of securing their data that they work with. Okay, so let's now talk about how corporate data is typically protected. And I'm coming at this from more of a Microsoft data protection and data security perspective. There's different ways that I've seen this in the overall data security space phrased. But I find that within the Microsoft space, we like to use this phrasing: classify, label, and protect. Classifying your data is really all about understanding what data you have within the organization. And it's super important to have this. This is often a prerequisite to later controls like labeling that data according to its sensitivity level and protecting it as well. So classification really happens, of course, there's different types of classifiers, but we'll focus on sensitive information types in this session. So these are things like a credit card number or a social insurance number, social security number. There's different types of sensitive information types that are defined by Microsoft out of the box. I think it's 300 plus at the moment, that recognize these different sensitive information depending on where you are in the world. So I'm based in Canada. There's a sensitive information type for Canada passport numbers. If you're based in Azerbaijan, there is one as well, right? So this is all about classifying your data, understanding your data landscape. You can have custom sensitive information types defined. So if you have a particular marker for, let's say, customer identification that are used, or maybe projects number identification, you can define a sensitive information type for that as well. So it just depends on your use case. So after your data is classified, we move on to labeling that data. Oftentimes, and this is really where the key difference between kind of Microsoft view on this and other general view, classification and labeling is often put into one category. But from a Microsoft perspective, classification is really about understanding the data that you have with these classifiers, such as sensitive information types. And then labeling is applying Microsoft Purview information protection sensitivity labels to that data. So after you identify it, you have sensitivity labels that you can define. And I'll walk through like a typical sensitivity labeling schema that I find is deployed to many organizations. And those sensitivity labels, they are a key piece of identifying the sensitivity level of the data that you're working with. So let's say you have two Excel files. One Excel file just has maybe some dummy data, nothing very sensitive. The other Excel file has customer credit card information along with the customer full name. Then you would have different sensitivity labels applied that identify that second Excel file maybe as confidential or restricted data. And within the label itself, we can also control and protect sensitive information with encryption. Then we move on to the protect, and I realize I used the word protect when I was describing labeling. By protect in the third column, I mean something very different. This is actually data loss prevention. So within Purview, this is protecting or preventing unauthorized sensitive data flow. So let's say we have that confidential Excel file that has customer credit card data and the full name of the customer included. We could then define a data loss prevention policy that prevents that data from being emailed externally. So this is protecting the flow of data. And this is really the typical data protection controls and steps that we see being deployed to protect corporate data. First, we're going to focus on sensitivity labels because I find that these have the largest impacts on end users. So what is a sensitivity label? First of all, there's a screenshot here. This is a typical view within an Excel file of sensitivity labels. If you want, you can go ahead, open an Excel file. If you see the sensitivity dropdown, you can then see which sensitivity labeling schema your organization has potentially deployed already to you. But these sensitivity labels, some key points, they are fully customizable. So as an organization, I can configure any type of sensitivity label with any name, even specifying color, descriptions, things like that within the Office applications. They are also clear text. So as you can see from the screenshot, they are human readable. We can see what the name of the sensitivity label is. And oftentimes when we hover over that sensitivity label, as the end user, we can also see a description of what this sensitivity label means and what type of data should be labeled with this label. So in our example, again, we have those two Excel files, one sensitive, one non-sensitive. The non-sensitive file, perhaps general, is the correct sensitivity label, and you can deduce that from the description. The sensitive file, because it has that credit card data and customer information, perhaps confidential is the correct sensitivity label to be applied. So it is very helpful that they're clear text. Sensitivity labels are also persistent. So they travel with the content wherever it is shared or even exported. And we'll go through this in the session, especially within Power BI, importing, exporting. The sensitivity label is actually held on throughout that process. There are limitations that are important to be aware of. However, it is fairly persistent. And then, as I mentioned before, protection can be applied with encryption from within that sensitivity label. So if you select a sensitivity label that has encryption, it maybe specifies a certain group of users only can open this file, or maybe it says a certain group of users can edit this file, all other users can only view. Depends on how you configure it. That protection will apply to the document, and it will also apply no matter where that document travels. Okay, so a typical sensitivity labeling schema that I often see deployed is something like this, from least sensitive on the left to most sensitive on the right. We have public, which is information that is free to share outside of the organization, such as marketing materials. Then we have general. So this is non-sensitive, but still day-to-day business content, something like meeting notes, maybe meeting transcriptions as well. Confidential, this tends to be the start of the more sensitive data. So sensitive content that should be carefully protected. Maybe it's something like strategic plans or credit card data. And then we have restricted, which is the highest sensitivity. It is information that will have a significant impact if it is exposed in a data breach. Things like personal health information maybe have some regulations, some legal requirements around protecting that data. So it is the most sensitive. Now, this is a general schema. I understand organizations often have different naming conventions. They may have different sublabels or label groups within each, but this is something oftentimes that I see leveraged. So within the examples that you'll see and the demo videos that I took, these are the sensitivity labels that you'll see me use. Okay, this slide is for the administrators in case we have any of them here. So configuring sensitivity labels in Excel and Power BI. We need to configure Power BI administrator settings, and we also need to configure the Purview labels within Microsoft Purview itself. So if I just zoom into this first screen, within the admin portal in Power BI, we have this setting here, allow users to apply sensitivity labels for content. So we need to ensure that that is enabled. We also have some customization settings like applying sensitivity labels from data sources to their data in Power BI. So that's the inheritance upon importing data into Power BI, just automatically inheriting the sensitivity label. And there's some nuances there. I won't go through this in too much detail, but if you are an administrator and have questions around configuring it, feel free to reach out. It also is not enough to just configure sensitivity labels in the Power BI admin settings. We need to create the labels and publish them to your users within Microsoft Purview. So there is information protection solution within Purview. You go ahead, create the sensitivity labels within the sensitivity labels tab within Purview. And again, fully customizable. You define the name, description, the look and feel of those labels, encryption settings as well. And then we have policies where there are label publishing policies, and we need to publish our labels out to users. So I won't drain it with detail, but if you have any maybe issues you've been running into with publishing sensitivity labels to your users, then feel free to ask any questions afterwards. Okay, back to the end user perspective. There are different ways that we can apply sensitivity labels. We can apply sensitivity labels manually. So as the end user, I go ahead and select which label is applied. This type of application takes priority over the automatic and default. So as the end user, I have the power to overwrite any automatically or default applied label. There is also an automatic way of applying sensitivity labels. It's more system driven. As the end user, you could perhaps interact with a recommendation from the system, or the system could just apply the label without having to have your approval to apply it. Anyways, you'll see this all in the demo. And then there's default labels. So as an administrator, I can set up for the entire organization. There will be a sensitivity label, let's say general, applied to all of our content, and it ensures that all of our content is labeled. Okay, so let's get into some demo videos and end user experience here. First, applying sensitivity labels. So these are just some demo videos that I took from my own dev tenant, and we'll start off with Excel. So manually labeling Excel files. This is built into the Office application. It is user-driven. So let me quickly play the video. You'll see I have an Excel file. I have that sensitivity dropdown, and I go ahead, I select internal as the label that I want applied. And then you can see after I go through that process, the internal sensitivity label is applied to this Excel file. So now let's say this file, maybe you email it externally or whatever, you share it with a certain user, that sensitivity label will remain applied. So it is persistent. Okay. So simple, just a drop down that you select. Let's move on to a different type of manual labeling. There is the option for your organization to deploy what's called the Microsoft Purview Information Protection Client. The main benefit of this client is that it extends labeling capabilities to other file types that are not only Office applications. So what you saw on the previous slide was natively within the Excel Office application, I was able to label. But if you have CSVs, for example, this Microsoft Purview Information Protection Client is required to label that. This also extends to PDFs, image files. There's really a long list of files that this client enables for labeling. So this is the experience. It's a little bit different. You actually have to start from outside of the file within the File Explorer. And you go ahead, you right-click on the file, you click Show More Options, apply sensitivity label with Microsoft Purview. Now, I'll just pause there. If you do not see that option, that probably means your organization hasn't deployed the client. But if you do see it, you will be able to select that and look at the labels that you have deployed. Let's say we want to upgrade the sensitivity label to internal only. And I go ahead, click Apply. It works for a bit and closes. So now that sensitivity label that I selected via the right-click method with the client is applied to this particular file. It also is convenient because this is done from the File Explorer. If you have, let's say, 10 files that you know all need to be labeled as internal, you can go ahead, select those 10 files, right-click, and apply the sensitivity label to all of those there. Whereas the previous experience that I showed you within the Office application, that needs to happen for each file individually, right? So pros and cons, but different capabilities for sure. Okay, so that was manual labeling. Let's now move on to different flavors of automatic sensitivity labels. Within Excel, we have the ability to set up label recommendations. So the system kind of drives this, but the user is involved in the end result. And you'll see this in the demo. So we have an Excel file. Currently, it only says credit card number, but there's no actual sensitive data in the file itself. Then let me just click play. I paste a credit, there we go. I paste a credit card number into this file. Now this file actually does have sensitive data, and the system recognizes that. So within a couple of seconds, oops, let's go back here. Within a couple of seconds, you'll see that policy tip come up at the top of the file, and it says your organization recommends that you change the sensitivity to confidential. That's because the administrators, we have set up rules that say if there's a credit card number, automatically recommend that this file is actually labeled as confidential because that is sensitive data. Then you can see that currently the sensitivity label applied is general. However, if I go ahead and click Change Now as the end user, I have control over that. The label is now upgraded to confidential. And what's more is, this is a fairly minor detail, however, it has impacts. This sensitivity label has this kind of lockbox, which means it has encryption and it actually enforces access rights for the users. And we'll see the impacts of those access rights and encryption settings in just a moment. All right, so that was recommended labeling. Now let's move on to a different type of automatic labeling. This is system driven. The end user is not asked or recommended to apply the label. The system simply applies the label that it deems to be fit. So we have, again, this Excel file. Currently, it's labeled as internal. It doesn't really have any sensitive data within it. And then if I play the video, go ahead and I paste a full name with a social insurance number. This is fake data, of course, but in the real world, let's say that this is actually sensitive. And then we have this policy tip up here. Experience is very similar. However, you'll notice that it said your organization automatically applied the sensitivity restricted, and you have no button that says change now because it was automatically applied. And if I go ahead and look at the sensitivity label, automatically restricted was applied because that's just how the administrators configured it in the backend. And you can also see that that restricted label is also encrypting. Okay, so again, as the end user, you always have the capability to manually override this sensitivity label. Let's say, as was in my case, I know that this is just dummy data, this actually isn't sensitive. And I want to downgrade the sensitivity label back to internal because it's not actually restricted data. I can go ahead and do that. I have full power, full capability as the end user to do that. However, I find that this kind of automatic labeling helps to increase the accuracy, especially as the Excel file evolves over time. So you can see that certain Excel files, they start off non-sensitive, but then they end up maybe getting some credit card numbers or some social insurance numbers, as you've seen in the demo videos. So that automatic label application becomes important. Okay. So just to summarize, within Excel, automatically applied labels. As I mentioned before, I didn't have a demo on this. It's not a very exciting demo. It's just default labeling. So when you create a new file or you edit an unlabeled file, a default label can be applied, let's say general. Then you saw in the demo, the recommend a label over here, which was where the end user can actually decide, is this label applied or not? Then we saw automatic label upon creation or updating of the document within that last demo video. Something I didn't show, again, not the most exciting demo, but powerful capabilities, is the automatic label that's applied to data at rest within OneDrive and SharePoint. So not all documents are always being edited, as you know, so we do have significant footprints of data at rest within SharePoint and OneDrive. So as the administrator, we can automatically label that content as well. Alrighty. Okay, that was Excel. Let's switch to the Power BI service and the Power BI desktop experience. So we're in the Power BI service. We have the capability, again, if the administrators configure it, to manually apply sensitivity labels to reports and dashboards. And this is user-driven again. So let's say we have a dashboard, we click on these three dots, we go ahead and click settings, and then we'll see sensitivity label drop down, and we can select which sensitivity label we want to have applied. Something I want to note, and this is a significant limitation of labeling within the Power BI service, is this yellow box. Some sensitivity label settings, such as file encryption settings and content marking, are not enforced in Power BI. What this means is, let's say we have the restricted sensitivity label with encryption. Let's say that encryption specifies that only users within the organization can open this document because it's very sensitive data. Just an example. That encryption will not be applied even if you apply the restricted label to a specific dashboard or report, let's say. You need to actually control that access from the Power BI service, even if that encrypting sensitivity label is applied. So something very important to note. Now that actually is different within the Power BI desktop. So if you apply an encrypting sensitivity label to a PBIX file, then the access controls will be applied there. However, this is a unique limitation to the Power BI service. We have a similar experience for manually labeling semantic models and data flows within the Power BI service. So we have the three dots, click settings, select our sensitivity label, and again, we have that yellow box warning us that encryption will not be applied. Content marking is also fairly important. You'll see that in a demo. It's more of a user awareness content marking. It's like a header, footer, or a watermark of your data. And it says maybe restrict it or do not share externally, things like that. Again, fully customizable. However, the file encryption settings I find to be a very key point to, or a very key limitation to point out. All right. Let's shift to the desktop. So manual labeling within the Power BI desktop experience, user-driven. It's very similar to what you saw within the Office application experience for Excel. So within the file itself, we have the sensitivity dropdown. I go ahead, I click the sensitivity label that I want applied, and then it's a little bit hard to show you. There we go. So this is where we see which sensitivity label is applied. It's fairly small. However, there is a marking if you know where to look for it. Okay, so again, totally user-driven here. Now let's look at automatically applied labels in Power BI. And just a fair warning, this slide can be a lot. There's a lot of text, but there will be demos and stuff to kind of flesh it out afterwards. So first use case I want us to look at is importing from the Power BI desktop into the Power BI service. Automatic labeling in Power BI is not the same concept as automatic labeling for Excel. For Excel, we saw recommended labeling, automatic application, things like that. Within Power BI, automatic labeling typically happens through something called label inheritance. So if we import from the desktop into the service, let's say we have a label applied in the Power BI desktop. That label will be automatically applied to the semantic model and the report that's created in the Power BI service. So it's not a fancy, let's look at the data contained within the report and recommend a label to the user. It is a simple inheritance of the label that's currently applied to the Power BI desktop file. If this scenario applies, let's say you've already kind of imported into the service previously, and then we have a different sensitivity label that's applied to the desktop file, then it can overwrite the existing labels within the semantic model and the report in the service, but that's a fairly unique scenario. Okay, so that's importing. Exporting is also similar concept. So if we export from the Power BI service to the desktop, the most restrictive sensitivity label that's currently applied to the semantic model and the report in the service is the sensitivity label that will automatically be inherited with the PBIX file. So again, it's nothing dynamic based on the data that you have. It's simply inheriting the sensitivity label that's most restrictive within the Power BI service to the PBIX file. So most restrictive means, let's say you have semantic model being labeled as confidential and the report itself is labeled as restricted, then the resulting exported file will have the restricted sensitivity label applied. Okay. Sensitivity label inheritance, this is referring to newly created content that's pointing at data sources that already have sensitivity labels applied. So in this case, the resulting report will have the sensitivity label automatically inherited. There are limitations to be aware of. So this label inheritance, when you point at content, let's say an Excel file that is already labeled, there are limitations, and it currently only works for Excel files in OneDrive and SharePoint, as well as Azure Synapse Analytics data sources and Azure SQL database. So that's what's supported. Other data sources, even if they are labeled, that label inheritance is not supported to this day. Okay, and we also have the ability to specify a default label within Power BI. So by default, any new content created within Power BI will inherit, let's say, the general sensitivity label. And then more for administrators, we have REST APIs if you need to do programmatic labeling that can help with labeling at scale. Okay, so let's dig into the export experience. As I mentioned, there are some limitations, and there's only certain export paths that are currently supported for sensitivity label inheritance. The first, as I mentioned, Excel, PDF, and PowerPoint are supported for sensitivity label inheritance. Analyze in Excel, creating a pivot table in Excel with a live connection. Live connection is important as well because when you go ahead and let's say you update the sensitivity label applied at the data source, that Excel file with the live connection will also have the sensitivity label updated. So it's a pretty cool feature. Also, downloading to PBIX is a supported export path for sensitivity label inheritance. If you're trying to export and it's not one of the ways that is mentioned here, that label inheritance will not be supported. So just to summarize kind of everything we've gone through from a label application perspective, let's look at, again, typical workflow. Let's say we have a data source, maybe an Excel file that is labeled as confidential. We create a semantic model and we specify that labeled Excel file as the data source. And because the Excel file is labeled as confidential, the semantic model itself will inherit that confidential sensitivity label. Let's now say we create a report that references the semantic model. Because the semantic model is labeled, the report will now inherit the confidential sensitivity label as well. Let's now say the report, we want to export it, maybe share it with other people. If it's one of those supported export paths, let's say we export it to an Excel file or a PBIX file, the confidential sensitivity label will also be applied to that exported content. So the protections that are, let's say, within the confidential sensitivity label will travel with the file, no matter where you import or export. Okay. We talked about applying labels. Let's now talk about the impacts of applying labels. As an end user, these are the impacts that you are likely able to see if you have labels deployed. So I mentioned content markings earlier on. And content markings, again, it's maybe a header, a footer, or a watermark within Excel that helps to raise the user awareness of what is the sensitivity level of this document that I'm working with. So in this demo, we have the confidential label applied, and I specified that confidential label will also apply a footer to the Excel file, and that's what it looks like there. There are also impacts with permissions, so this is the encryption portion. Label permissions that are specified within encryption will take precedence over any SharePoint or OneDrive sharing. So in this example, I shared an Excel file with Diego, and I gave him full edit access from SharePoint. But Diego goes ahead and opens that file, and they will see this. Sorry, you don't have permission to open this document because this document is protected by a rights management service such as Azure Information Protection. This is, oops, there we go. This is actually an expected workflow because the encryption settings that are defined at the label level actually prevent this particular user, because he is unauthorized to view it, to go ahead and open this document. Okay, so this is one of those major impacts, and actually really where the data security controls come into play for Excel labeling with encrypted sensitivity labels. Okay. Similar demo here, but what we saw in the previous video was a full block of the user. Let's say in the label encryption settings, Diego has access, but it specifies that he only has view access because he shouldn't be editing this particular document. So if we go here, and again, I shared the file with Diego. Diego goes to open the file. He has access, he can open the document, but it's read only. So as expected, the encryption settings, even if I gave him edit access from SharePoint Online, the encryption settings will take precedence and Diego will only have view access. Okay. Labeling impacts for Excel in Copilot. So this is one of those Gen AI use cases. Depending on the encryption settings, we can actually restrict Copilot from processing the data that we have within Excel. So we upload a file, we ask Copilot to summarize it, and it says it looks like I wasn't able to access this because the access was denied, and that's due to the encryption settings that we have applied to that file. This is useful for protecting your most sensitive data from cases like oversharing, where your users may be able to access sensitive data that they shouldn't be able to access through M365 Copilot. Within Power BI, the label impacts are slightly different. So accessing files, as I mentioned within the Power BI service, even if you have encryption settings applied within the labels, that access, the encryption settings will not be applied. So you need to manage access within the Power BI service itself. That's different in the desktop because sensitivity labels with encryption actually do provide or control the access to the content. Exporting content, as we went through, there are some supported exporting paths that inherit sensitivity labels. Export will fail if a label can't be applied when data is exported, and you'll see that error message. Publishing content, so again, we went through the cases where sensitivity labels will be inherited by the semantic model and the report. And then there's an important limitation here. So guest users are unable to publish a protected PBIX file from the desktop to the service. So your guest users, if you do have encryption settings within your sensitivity labels, they will need to exclusively work in the service. We can also specify mandatory labels. So this means that your users have to apply a label before editing or saving the content. And that experience is fairly similar within the service and the desktop. And then label visibility, as you see within the screenshots, it's a little bit different within the desktop versus the service. However, you can still see the fact that the highly confidential label is applied. Okay, so coming back to our corporate data protection strategies, we talked about sensitivity labeling. I know we're running up on time, so I will speed up this last section. We'll talk about data loss prevention very shortly. Now, I'm not talking about data loss prevention within Power Platform. That's a very different concept. I'm talking about data loss prevention within Microsoft Purview. So again, controlling the flow of sensitive data. Data loss prevention within Purview can be applied to many different locations. We can apply it to files within Microsoft 365 and emails within Exchange Online as well. We can control endpoint activities. We can apply data loss prevention controls to non-Microsoft applications, so things like controlling uploading of information to Dropbox, right? Like non-Microsoft cloud applications. We can also have some data loss prevention capabilities, albeit a little bit limited, but they still apply within on-premises locations if you do have that enabled. And we have additional capabilities for M365 Copilot and Copilot Chat as well. The key point I want to make here, I know there's a lot of text, a lot of details on the slide. The key point is Excel files. They can actually be in scope of M365 DLP, endpoint data loss prevention if they're stored locally. They can be uploaded to non-Microsoft applications, and they can also be stored within on-prem. So all of the 4 types of data loss prevention apply there. Power BI is specific to Microsoft 365 data loss prevention, and that is where we really configure and control Power BI data flows. Within SharePoint on OneDrive, Microsoft Excel files, you can monitor, notify, or block your users with data loss prevention. This short demo video has an example of notifying your users that a particular file contains sensitive data. So your users will see a policy tip. You can go ahead and click View Policy Tip and actually see that this item contains credit card data. So that is really the data loss prevention tip that we specified. DLP for Power BI is a little bit different. We do have the ability to alert administrators with no end user impact of the fact that there is sensitive data stored within particular Power BI files. We can also notify our end users, as you just saw within Excel. And we can restrict access to Power BI files with DLP. However, this is a capability that's in preview. I do expect some changes. However, currently you can actually restrict only owners and members of the organization. Only owners of the file or members of the organization do have access to the Power BI file, which essentially restricts guest access and external users. Okay. So let's loop back to our initial workflow. We have our typical Excel file that has customer names, revenue, a couple of account numbers, has some sensitive data within. We then build a dashboard with that Excel file as our data source, and we go ahead and share our file. Now, with all of the controls that I went through today, we now know that our sensitive data is monitored and protected, and we enable productivity. As end users, we know how to work with the controls, and the administrators know the impacts and the expected impacts that these controls will have on their end users. So some quick takeaways for end users. If your current organization is going through some Microsoft Purview data security control rollouts, start by observing and being curious. Do you have labels currently deployed? What are the impacts that you are seeing from those labels? Make sure that you understand permissions before applying sensitivity labels with encryption. Lots of the impacts that we went through today were around encrypting sensitivity labels. Even if we share it with the user within SharePoint, for example, the permissions on the Excel file will take precedence. So make sure you understand those before applying that. Pay attention to policy tips and sensitive data warnings. So we saw multiple instances of those. They are there to help you protect your data and warn you that there is sensitive data. And also, of course, do not be afraid to reach out to your dedicated support team if you have any issues. From an administrator perspective, some key takeaways. Do not make labeling complicated. End users are interacting with the labels, so it is already on top of their day-to-day business workflows. You know, 4 labels is oftentimes enough. There are, of course, cases with sub-labels and additional labels needed. However, labeling really shouldn't be complicated because a complicated labeling schema is hard for your end users to actually work with. Follow a phased rollout approach, understand the expected impacts, monitor first before blocking, and make sure really that you work with your users throughout this phased rollout approach to roll out data security controls that are effective, but also enable productivity. In the same vein, invest in organizational change management. Make sure your users are aware of the changes that are coming. They are well trained and know what to expect. So they know the labeling impacts, for example, that we went through in today's session. And finally, understand the capabilities of sensitivity labeling and DLP in Power BI. I did call out a couple of the limitations. I think it is very important to be aware that sensitivity labeling and data loss prevention for Excel and for Power BI is very different, and just understanding the differences is important. All right, I'm a little bit over, but thank you so much for joining today's session. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna, for your wonderful session. First of all, I kindly ask you to share the QR code that we can scan and subscribe to your user group, if it's okay for you.
Sure.
Okay. And also, I have placed 2 questions in the chat box. So if you have an opportunity, please read those questions and answer. By the way, if anyone who has any question can just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I just read the first question there. An employee downloads several confidential Excel workbooks shortly before leaving the organization. Security team needs to identify unusual activity and prevent further data loss. Okay, which controls should be used? So I would say that this is actually a combination of the sensitivity labeling, data loss prevention, and insider risk management, which I didn't cover in this session. I'll start from insider risk management. That one is more actually, there's an exact policy template for this type of data flow where it identifies users that are about to leave the organization. Maybe they've submitted their resignation. And it starts to monitor their activity because this is a very typical kind of data exfiltration before finishing at your current position type of activity that we see. And that will alert your administrators. Now, insider risk management, it doesn't actually block, right? It's just an alert. It is an awareness tool. What does block is data loss prevention and sensitivity labels. So I actually will go back to insider risk management. We can tell the user that we have recognized this activity and that they shouldn't go ahead and exfiltrate. That is definitely a capability there. But data loss prevention and sensitivity labels is what will block your user from sharing that sensitive data externally. So sure, maybe they did actually succeed in downloading that sensitive data. However, when they go to upload it to their personal Dropbox account, let's just say, or maybe email that data externally, data loss prevention will block it. if data loss prevention doesn't block it and that sensitivity label is applied with encryption, the encryption settings will prevent users from accessing the file itself. So it's a multi-layered approach. And these are the things that we work to kind of identify how to productively monitor and prevent these types of data flows. But very good question. It's a very common example of data exfiltration.
Okay, I hope, yeah, more questions in the chat box.
Yeah, okay, let me read the one below. Some employees work across multiple departments. Power BI report must show each employee data for every department they are authorized to access. How should dynamic security be designed? Interesting question here. How should dynamic security be designed? So I'll take this in a sensitivity label direction, but if the user who asked this question is on the call, if this isn't the direction you're thinking, then feel free to chime in. Dynamic security. So with the sensitivity labels controls that we discussed, encryption, right? That's like what actually protects the files within the label. As I mentioned, the service, the encryption, the access controls within the encryption will not be applied. So if you're talking through this or talking about the service, I would say manage that dynamic security with access controls on the service level. However, if we're working with a desktop file and we share that desktop file out, then the sensitivity label with encryption will need to make sure to either add the users across different departments so that they are authorized to access. So that's actually the main way that I would say. So I don't know if I interpreted that question correctly, but I think it's a good question with dynamic security controls, but it depends exactly on the scenario that we're talking about.
And last question from Imani and also Damu. So please contest it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. I just left the webinar. Just reading quickly.
okay. Okay.
Okay, Imane, if you could reach out to me with some screenshots that you're seeing, I can look into the error more deeply. I haven't personally encountered this just yet, but I could try and help and see if I can replicate your error that you're seeing.
And
Yeah.
excellent session with great info. Just thanks down to you. And second question from Mani, who says that for the second question, is the role level security can work for this case and attribute a role for each user with specific authorization? I think this is the continuation of the first question, or
Yep. So
okay.
definitely, I did not cover row level security in this particular session. I was covering more file level controls, but that is one of the controls that I would suggest looking at for sure. It's a good call out.
I will send you the screenshot that she's going to send me. And last question from Damu, who says that what's the best way to anonymize the data in Excel before sending it to a dev to work on it and then de-anonymize back? Maybe I didn't pronounce the word correctly, but I hope
Yeah.
that's all right. Yeah.
Anonymizing the data. So none of the controls that I discussed today will directly anonymize or de-anonymize the data. From the controls that I discussed today, what I would suggest is you have your de-anonymized data, if that's the right word to use, within let's say an Excel file that is protected with encryption. Then you work on anonymizing the data so it's no longer as sensitive, right? You can't actually trace the sensitive data to the particular person. And then you create a copy of that file with a different sensitivity label that is according to the sensitivity label of that file now with the anonymized data. And that anonymized data is shared with the dev so that they can work on it. As soon as that data but that data will then need to be integrated back into that de-anonymized file. So from the controls that I discussed today, I would suggest that you retain a copy with that sensitivity label that applies encryption and protects the highly sensitive data. And then you have another working copy that you work from that has more lenient controls because it is not as sensitive of data. So,
Okay. So I would like to thank Anna to you for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thank you all attendees for being part of this learning community and for attending this session. I look forward to seeing you in our upcoming meetups, not methods. So I'm just going to stop live streaming on